I'm Adrian Kuzminski. I'm the moderator of Sustainable Otsego, and we are very pleased to have Zephyr Teachout here with us this evening. Let me just make a couple of thanks here at the very beginning. A couple of people who have helped make this event possible. One of them is Julie Huntsman, who has volunteered to help out in various ways. And the other is my wife, Antoinette Kuzminski, who is over there somewhere, and she also has done a lot to make this possible, believe me. Okay, so let me give a little introduction here of Zephyr. Zephyr Teachout is a constitutional law professor at Fordham University who has dedicated her career to the study of corruption and the laws that govern political behavior. She was born and raised on a farm in Vermont and attended Yale and Duke universities. After receiving her law degree from Duke, she clerked for Chief Judge Edward Roy Becker of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. She is a leading expert on the influence of money on politics. Her arguments were cited by the Citizens United case by Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. She has a book coming out from Harvard University Press entitled Corruption in America, From Benjamin Franklin's Snuffbox, believe it or not, to Citizens United. She has worked to break up big banks and was involved with Occupy Wall Street. She was the first national director of the Sunlight Foundation, an advocate, a nonprofit advocate for open government. And she pioneered 21st century grassroots mobilizing models as director of online organizing for Howard Dean's presidential campaign. And some of you might remember how innovative and important that was historically. Zephyr is currently a candidate for the Democratic nomination for governor of New York State. Her running mate, Tim Wu, popularized the idea of net neutrality and has championed an open internet. So now I give you Zephyr, and she'll make a speech, and then there'll be a Q&A after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and thank you so much, Adrian, for making this happen. And thank you for this exquisite courthouse. I saw Adrian and I said, I just drove through the most beautiful country in the world. We better ban fracking right away. So I think we're at this really critical juncture in New York history. There's two directions we can go. We can go in the Andrew Cuomo direction, which is trickle-down economics, crony capitalism, failure of leadership, failure to answer basic questions, abandonment of public infrastructure and public education. Or we can move towards renewing the extraordinary, abundant, diverse state that we have and actually building infrastructure, investing in schools, investing in public education, investing in affordable broadband, building a small business and family farm economy. And I have this vision of economy and democracy that works for all of us, not just the wealthy and wealthy. And because I think we are at this crossroads, I am challenging Andrew Cuomo in the Democratic primary to be the next governor of the state of New York. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about Andrew Cuomo, just to give you an introduction to myself, an introduction to what I see with Andrew Cuomo. Where we are in the race, some of the things that I care about, and then let's have a real conversation. You know, this is a wonderful evening to have a nice, slow discussion and debate ideas, and I'm also here to listen. I don't know if any of you know the jazz artist Rasan Roland Kirk. Okay, you do. He played 4 instruments at the same time. And the only way he did it is he learned circular breathing, so he could breathe at the same time as he was blowing out the saxophone and flute. It's up through his nose. So I figure politics at its best is this kind of circular breathing. So I want to take in and not just push out tonight. But we'll first do the saxophone part. So I was raised in, God, I feel like I'm stuck behind that. Can you guys hear me here?
Yeah.
Okay. I was raised in rural Vermont, a place that was very similar in some ways to this, near a town called Norwich, Vermont.
We're from Norwich, New York.
Oh, you're from Norwich, you're right, there's one, yes. Outside of town about 2000, and I grew up about 5 miles outside of town. Our school bus had the word school bus painted on it, but otherwise it was a station wagon just for us and one other kid. And I had 3 sisters and a brother and 50 acres and a lot of chores. We were a little late today running into a hay truck. I will tell you, I know haying. And a lot of stacking wood, a lot of penny per potato bug into the gas can, which you then later light on fire. Killing chickens once in a while, actually every year. Chickens, sheep, a pig. My parents, my dad had been an officer in the Army in Vietnam. And I remember him telling me this story so much when I was a little kid, and had a big impact on me about how he was once asked, he was a lawyer already when they called him up to be an officer, and they asked him to give a speech about the Geneva Conventions. He was stationed in Japan. So he gave a speech in which he said that as he understood it, the United States was violating the Geneva Conventions. And 30 officers walked out, and most of the privates stayed and cheered. But it was an important story. I feel like I learned from my dad the importance of standing up when you think something's going really wrong. Now, of course, he could take that to a different level when I was about 8 years old. So remember that school bus I told you about? That came to within a mile of where I lived. So to get there, I had to go a mile every morning. So I became a very fast runner. So there's no way to teach an 8-year-old how to become fast except by saying you have to be there by 7 a.m. and it's 6:50. Wow. Anyway, so I'm about 8 years old, and my dad decides, you know, it really will make him a farmer and not a law professor if he gets a bull. So he went out and got a Black Angus, about 3 or 4 months old, and it immediately broke through all the fences that we tried to put up for it because we were not ready for this bull. So it escaped and it got into our neighbor's yard, and then it got into our other neighbor's corn, which was a much bigger problem because you do not want to be trampling corn. So he was trying, I remember one November we were running around with a little piece of rope trying to rope it back in, and then he finally realized the thing to do is to get his 8-year-old daughter to walk up to it, bother it a little bit, and then run like hell. The bull is chasing me, so I ran inside the fence. The bull is chasing me, my dad chasing the bull, and then hopped outside the fence, and he closed the fence gate and got the bull back inside.
What did your mother say?
So I'm running for the governor of the state of New York.
And the bull is?
Anyway, after that I went to Yale, as you mentioned in your generous introduction. Thank you. And my first job out of Yale was as a special ed teacher's aide in a small rural public school. And that has very much influenced one of the key themes of my campaign, which is thinking about really investing in schools and giving them the resources they need so that every child can have attention paid to them. Because I saw with one of the kids I was working with, he'd been through 5 foster homes. He was a smart kid, but had a lot of emotional difficulties. He was a kicker, and we were in a classroom of 12. Well, I'll tell you one kid who's being disruptive in a classroom of 12 in 3rd grade can disrupt the whole class. And we had the resources. This is a rural public school, but with decent resources, that I could be there and be paying attention to this child and be talking him through and pulling him out of the class when needed, but otherwise allowing him to work with the other kids so that it didn't disrupt. When I think of teachers now without those resources and how difficult it is to pay that attention, something that very much influences one of the sort of core philosophies that I bring to this. I think of public education as the infrastructure of democracy. So after that, I went to law school at Duke, and I got a master's in political science at the same time. You kept saying I was an expert. It's very nice. Yeah, so no, it's in the bio.
I may have edited that.
No. But I will tell you that my master's degree in political science taught me almost nothing about politics compared to my later work in politics. After that, I was a death penalty lawyer for a while in North Carolina. I represented people on death row, and then also started an organization modeled on basically training young lawyers to be a 3rd lawyer on capital cases. They could get training in the courtroom, because I saw that, in criminal defense, there were so many people who didn't have trial training, and so we needed to provide that trial training young so people could go on to do other felony trials.
I'm told they can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
You may need the,
I'll go back.
you
I'm
may
sorry.
need the microphone.
I'll go back. Is that better?
Yes.
All right. I'm just going to lean in a little bit. And so after that work, I have spent the last 12 years in politics in one form or another. I've worked on presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns, congressional campaigns, local campaigns of all kinds, and I love politics, as you could probably tell. And then I also helped start other nonprofits. I was the national director of the Sunlight Foundation, as you mentioned, which is one of the largest anti-corruption organizations in the country. And the more I got involved in politics, the more I saw that there was this root issue, this root thing that was actually keeping us away from doing politics the way it's supposed to be done, which is like this in this courthouse tonight. And the root issue was the way that campaign funding systems led politicians to serve donors instead of the public. And there's another related root issue, which is how private power, when concentrated, when it gets too monopolistic, when it becomes J.P. Morgan instead of your community bank, that starts taking over politics. So that in 2008, after the financial crisis, I actively lobbied around financial reform for several years after 2008, started a group dedicated to doing on-the-Hill lobbying, engaging grassroots organizers on on-the-Hill lobbying around derivatives and other kinds of financial reform. It was impossible to enact laws that the majority of the country believed in because too many people were dependent upon the big banks. So I would see something like the financial transaction tax, which is a wildly popular national thing. When polled, it's not a lot of advocates for it, so you may not have heard of it. Don't worry about that. But when people poll on it, they hear, oh, well, maybe financial institutions should pay for transactions the way that you pay for a sales transaction, pay their fair share. People like the idea. But it's not being proposed aggressively and passed because it is too dangerous to propose it because of the threat of the big banks coming down. So my research, my academic research at Fordham Law School, first at Duke and then at Fordham Law School, has very much tracked this concern, this sense that our country cannot afford to go in the direction of no longer serving the public, because we have an extraordinary tradition of civic life here, of actual responsiveness. It's never been perfect. But we do have a tradition here of people coming together and asking, what should we do? How should we solve this problem? As opposed to a few wealthy interests dictating what we should do and whether or not we're even going to address this problem. So, this history led a group of people to approach me in March about running against Andrew Cuomo. Because what they saw and what I saw is an example of how big money had taken over the extraordinary democratic tradition in the state of New York. I supported Andrew Cuomo when he ran for office 4 years ago. I was very excited about him. I had, as a kid, I told you I was a death penalty lawyer, so as a kid, I had been extremely inspired by Mario Cuomo's moral language and stance against the death penalty. And then Andrew Cuomo was running and he said, I see a problem in Albany, and the problem I see is the problem of money in politics, and I'm going to clean it up. His campaign slogan and his campaign booklet, it was, you know, this thick, was clean up Albany. And he stood on the steps of the Boss Tweed Courthouse in Manhattan and said he wanted to restore honor and dignity to the office of governor. He said he would close the loophole that allows corporations to give money directly to candidates in New York. He said he would pass public financing of elections. That's one of the things I care about the most. I mean, it's a system that allows a waitress to run for office without having rich friends. It allows a truck driver to run. And what we've seen is that when you pass public financing elections, far more women run for office because they don't worry about not having an old boys club network of friends who can fund them. I believed him when he said he would veto any gerrymandered incumbent protection redistricting, and that he would fight for fair districting in New York. So he has broken every single one of those promises and more. He has taken over $6 million in corporate campaign contributions from that very loophole that he once promised to close. Every year, and often more than once a year, he says that he believes in public financing of elections, that he believes we need to change the root issue in Albany, but it has become his favorite broken promise. Somebody asked me the other night when I was so embarrassed what my karaoke song was. And recently, I made one commitment in this campaign. I'm going to work like hell, I'm going to raise money, I'm going to do everything that you need to do in politics, but my one commitment is I'm going to tell the truth, so I had to answer honestly. The song in my head has been Randy Travis's Promises. Does anybody know that song? No. He has broken every single one of those promises. I'm not going to sing it. You don't want that. And then what's worse is he has not in any way governed as a Democrat in this democratic state. You may not believe it's a democratic state all the time when you're here, but it's 60% Democratic, 30% Republican. This is a state that believes in renewable energy. This is a state that believes in the DREAM Act and the Women's Equality Act, that believes in investing in infrastructure and all those things. And we should have a Democratic Senate, and we would have a Democratic Senate had Andrew Cuomo in fact followed through on his promise to veto those lines. We would have one right now. And then he also failed to campaign for Democrats, instead trumpeting his relationship with Republicans. Well, people like divided power, but you have to understand that that divided power has led to this great New York state ending up serving Republican as opposed to Democratic values. He led with one of the largest cuts to education funding in state history. He repeatedly loots from funds dedicated to one thing to serve his private pet projects. There's very few different pots of money that he doesn't see as an ATM if he has a particular donor or pet project to serve. And in years of studying, He has failed to take any clear stance on hydrofracking in this state. I was saying to Adrian on the drive here that I am so in awe of what people in this community have done. Really, really in awe. Because with the first fracking ban, you stood in front of this wave that was coming across the country. Every shale-rich state bowing down to the pro-fracking interests. And you stood here and said, no, we are going to ban fracking right here. And after that, the ripple went out and out and out, and we still have a moratorium because of your courage in standing against this wave. So thank you for that. I'm going to give you a round of applause if you want.
Go get him. Go get him.
Silent, refusing again and again to answer any questions about what direction we're going. I'll tell you, I am very worried. He's taken over $1 million in pro-fracking money, and I am very worried that he intends to do sort of a classic Cuomo, which is to say, I am maintaining the moratorium while I am doing a demonstration project.
Right.
And then 2 years later say, I've done the demonstration project, it's too late. Fracking, hydrofracking has come to New York. You just have to accept that this is the future. He talks that way about hospitals sometimes. After hospital closings, he just says, well, there's no real room for, there's no business model for hospitals in the future, so how are we, not my responsibility. He has failed to take responsibility for this sort of key moment. So I had this experience of betrayal, and I think many others did. This experience of hope and then betrayal, and I was approached to run for office, and at first he didn't believe that anybody was going to run against him. And then about 5 days before I announced, at the time I was running with the Democratic, I was planning to run in the Democratic primary and the Working Families primary, he said, he apparently told people, I hear there's some upstate female law professor. He probably thought it was somebody from Cornell, I don't know. I sort of expected somebody to be checking my mailbox, you know, spying. And then the minute the story of my campaign hit the New York Times, Andrew Cuomo, who has failed to fight for a Democratic Senate, suddenly said, to get the Working Families Party nomination, I will now fight for a Democratic Senate. Because I want this so badly. I can't deal with the humiliation of losing this party nomination. And I will fight for minimum wage, something he should have been fighting for before. And I will fight for the Women's Equality Act and DREAM Act, things he should have been fighting for before, and our mainstream democratic values that the majority of this state supports. So he won the Working Families Party nomination. I think he was surprised that he won 58 to 41 against a law professor that nobody knew. And then I think he thought we were done. There was not going to be a race. And I thought about bowing out at that point. But I talked to some people. I talked to some parents and teachers. And I talked to some practivists. They said, there's nothing for us in that deal. There's still a lot that Andrew Cuomo hasn't done. He still has not committed to being a true, traditional, progressive, populist Democrat. And we don't know whether we can believe him on these promises. So please stay in. Please, we need you to. So I announced that I was staying in, and he called a woman who's a friend of mine and said, what does she want? And my friend said, well, Mr. Governor, I think she wants to run for governor. But he told told his friends as I gathered that I wasn't going to get on the ballot because you need 15,000 signatures to get on the ballot in New York State. From all over the state, the distribution. I think some of you know that because I think the reason I am here is because of you. And we had 3 weeks to get on the ballot instead of the typical 5 weeks. We had no office. We had no staff, and I hadn't started fundraising yet. Some of you thought quite reasonably, there's no way she's getting on the ballot. He discounted the rage of Democrats who felt that betrayal. Because in 3 weeks, I'll give you a tidbit. We actually, because we didn't have an office large enough to manage canvassing, we used these public-private atriums in Manhattan that had been used by Occupy Wall Street as our staging grounds for this really massive operation. It's like building a small business very quickly. And we not only got 15,000, we got over 45,000 signatures to get on the ballot in the state of New York. And thank you to all of you who are part of it. So he sent his lawyer in and challenged those petitions. But when they went to look at them, they couldn't find enough particular problems, and so the court ruled that the petitions were valid, and we are on the ballot with our name above Andrew Cuomo's. But he's not done. So the next step, remember that bull?
Yes.
The bull has turned. The next step is to try to kick me off the ballot after I already got on. So he is now challenging my legitimacy as a New Yorker. The challenge, the technical challenge, is a residency challenge in New York. Under New York law, you need to have lived in New York for 5 years by the time of the election. Well, luckily, I have lived in New York since June 2009 when I accepted a tenure track job at Fordham Law School, and Fordham is still in New York. But he brought the suit, and we're not sure why, whether it was a fishing expedition because he got a subpoena asking for every bank record in the last 5 years, every document related to me in the last 5 years, every check written, every piece of mail that was delivered to my parents' house in New York. And I just today got out of my second day of trial. This is the trial of the crime of running against Andrew Cuomo in New York.
Get him.
Well, I am completely confident we are going to win, in part because the Working Families Party had 4 lawyers look at this. And it's pretty basic. I've lived in New York. That's all you need to do. So on Monday at 2 o'clock, I expect the final ruling, which will say we are staying on the ballot, beating Andrew Cuomo in round 2 of the trial to get me off the ballot. So we are on fire right now. I have New York Times has covered this race twice in the last week. The Post and the Daily News are covering it. We're getting more and more radio coverage. We're getting more and more local media coverage. And Andrew Cuomo is running scared. But the reason we're in this race isn't just to chase the bull. It's because we do have this different vision of New York, the vision that I alluded to in the beginning. I don't think it's just enough to stop the bad things that this administration has done. And his tax system is upside down, his economic development policy, Startup New York, there's various names of it, doesn't work, it's a lie. We spent $1.6 billion last year on tax breaks in this state, and they brought in less than 1% of the jobs. The promise of his economic development policy is jobs, and it's a false promise. And it's not fair to the people of New York to keep promising something that isn't going to come true, because people are hurting and they really need jobs. Well, I think there's a pretty old-fashioned way to go about getting jobs, and that's by building infrastructure, investing in infrastructure, investing in roads, in affordable broadband.
Yes.
Good bridges.
Investing in the transit systems that connect the state to itself. We are one of the largest transportation economies in the world in New York State, and we should be embarrassed that we are barely keeping it up instead of investing in being the leader in 21st century transportation, 21st century transportation technology. In my vision of New York, it is not just enough to ban fracking, which we have to do and I would do on the first day and push for because we have no choice. But we have to move forward and build. It's a little bit like campaign finance. It's not enough to just ban big money, you have to build a new system. And we have to build, but the wonderful thing about building renewables is that's jobs.
Yes.
Solar farms are jobs. Offshore wind is jobs, not just for the folks down there, but for the manufacturing up here. Building in hydro is jobs. And what's best about it is it's jobs and building a kind of power that we ourselves can take control of. So we are taking back our power by taking back our power, taking back our democratic power, our own authority over our power systems, at the same time as we are taking back our power from these big companies that have one motive, which is profit, and they do not care about the people in the state of New York and their health. I look at this state, I think one of the core differences is I see this abundant state full of resources that we can draw on. And when I hear Andrew Cuomo talk or Rob Astorino talk, I see them talk about a state that is scarce, that doesn't have enough, that needs to beg at the feet of oligarchs to get a few of them to move here. We are abundant, and we just have to trust that abundance and not become beggars. So in my vision of New York, we will actively invest in the smaller and medium-sized agriculture that I think is essential for food systems that are resilient, but also for an economy that is resilient. And it's healthier. So I want to see New York where we bust up. I'm an old-fashioned trust buster. Remember Teddy Roosevelt and FDR, governors of New York? Tim Wu and I came together and have been friends for a while, in fact, because we're both old-fashioned trust busters, and we think this is a missing piece in the way Democrats talk about politics. It's not just enough to redistribute wealth. We also have to take on this power and break it up. We gotta stop this Comcast-Time Warner merger. I don't know if any of you have cheap cable bills. Everybody's cable bills are too high, and the media you're getting is more and more limited because it's coming from fewer and fewer sources. New York State could stop this. We actually submitted a testimony today to the Public Service Commission, my running mate and I, to stop the Comcast-Time Warner merger. New York could stop it this summer. But it's not just Comcast-Time Warner. Look at what's happening with US Foods and Cisco. Food delivery systems that are merging. People don't talk about that as a political issue, but that's a political issue because that's how food is getting to your kids' schools. And those delivery systems have way too much power over local farmers because they're deciding who wins and who loses because you have to get in that stream or you're out of that stream. These are the new robber barons. These are the new railroads, and they're taking over our economy, and a governor who cared about the economy in the state of New York would protect family farms and protect small businesses from this takeover of these few monopolies that are threatening our democracy. I haven't even talked about Moreland. I want to give a chance for people to ask questions.
No, keep going.
So I talked about this race being on fire, but I did not talk about the one reason why it is on fire. It's in part because of people like you, but it's in part because something amazing happened 16 days ago.
Oh.
Insiders in Albany have known for a long time that Andrew Cuomo uses power in a particular way. Not serving the people of the state of New York. But you know, the governor of New York is actually the most powerful governor of all the 50 states. He has more appointments power, more control over commissions and boards, and more authority over local budgets. And he uses that to bring politicians, nonprofits, commissioners into his sphere of dependency. This is something I'm an expert on, because I studied the history of corruption in America, and when we started this country, the concern was that the king had too much power, and the king was using his power of appointments to have too much power over local legislators, over parliamentarians. It was called the problem of placement, where the king would place people in situations and then maintain control in the center. Well, we have a problem of placement here in New York. Now, insiders in Albany may have known this, and people out throughout the state may have felt this sense of why, in this deeply egalitarian state, why are we now the most unequal state in the country? Why is our infrastructure crumbling? Why is nothing not working? There's a sense of things not working, but not knowing why. And the Moreland Commission scandal may have helped start to answer some of those questions. Because what we learned is that Governor Cuomo's top aide was interfering in subpoenas that were to be issued by Deputy Attorneys General of the state of New York. This is called the Moreland Commission, and rightly called the Moreland Commission, but their formal role under New York law was Deputy Attorney Generals. Imagine if Barack Obama starts telling Deputy Attorney Generals, pull back that subpoena because it's getting too close to my top donors. That'd be a national scandal. And this Moreland Commission scandal, we still do not know what Governor Cuomo knew. We still do not know whether he directed this interference in subpoenas. These are subpoenas to Cuomo's business associates and donors. And the reason we don't know is guess how Governor Cuomo responded to this 7,000-word scorching story in the New York Times about his top aide and the anti-corruption commission he himself set up. Exactly.
Silence.
Silence. 5 days of silence. And then on the 5th day, he flew to Buffalo. I think he thought he could get away from the Albany press corps, and put on a puppet show about Startup New York, refusing, even in his press conference, his public press conference, to answer basic questions. What do you know? What do you know? What do you know? That phrase has particular resonance this week, because it is now 40 years, I think, from the creation of that, or around the creation of that phrase from Nixon's resignation. But this is a basic democratic question. What do you know? What was his involvement? We just want to know, a basic explanation. And he has failed to answer that still over 2 weeks later, instead doing a series of bizarre explanations, going from, it was my commission, my attorneys general, therefore I can do whatever I want with it, to it was totally independent. And you know it was independent because they didn't do what my aide said, which is sort of like saying, my witness tampering failed, so it wasn't witness tampering. And then his most remarkable response, because actually there were concerns about witness tampering in the situation, Preet Bharara, the federal prosecutor, warned him to stop telling people what to say about the Moreland Commission. And his response to the public was, okay, I am not going to talk about this anymore. Well, a governor who actually cared about the people of the state and wanted to lead and explain would understand the difference between witness tampering and giving a full explanation. But there seems to be a pattern here of a governor who no longer understands that laws are made for all of us, not just a few of us.
Yes.
And the same laws have to apply to all of us.
Yes.
You do not get an exception from those laws because you are wealthy and well-connected.
Right on.
So, in the last 2 weeks, his failure of leadership, because that's what it is. I mean, you guys know this silence, right? You know the silence in the Moreland Commission because you've been living with it for years on fracking. What do you believe? Silence. What are we going to do? What is the plan? And you know how that's slowing economic growth. Because if we're not actively moving towards towards renewables. We need to ban fracking so we can move forward and move to the next step instead of being stuck in this limbo. And I'll tell you, that limbo is very good for fundraising, because then you can go to different groups and try to raise money from them, saying, look, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. That's not leadership, though. He gets credit sometimes for smart politics, but that's not leadership. And the most fundamental job of a governor is to listen, explain, lead, and serve the people of the state of New York. I would be honored to have that job. And I thank you for listening to me for far longer than I expected to as I talk about some of these issues, and I'm happy to take questions, and thank you for being here tonight. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Or actually, you know how at events like this people say sometimes no comments, just questions? I'm actually really happy to take comments. I want to learn. I want to hear either what you see right now that isn't working, or what your vision is, what you think, what direction you think we should go in.
Hi, we're from a group called Oneonta Area for Public Education, and we have a lot of concerns about what's happening in education right now. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned earlier a little bit about funding, but high-stakes testing, modules, scripted curriculum, things of that nature.
Yeah. I'm opposed to Common Core. I think we should halt it, and as governor, I would lead a delegation of parents and teachers to Washington to figure out how we could negotiate with the federal government to make sure that, see if it's possible to not lose funding. Because I think what we've seen is that Common Core, I was attracted to the idea when I first heard it, shared standards from everyone, but it's actually an example of this kind of concentrated private power taking over governmental power, that Bill Gates has spent over $200 million on pushing this idea. And this is just the idea of one wealthy man who has no experience in education, trying to force down the throats of educators who know a lot more about it, a certain set of ideas. So if we're going to have a shared set of standards, I think they should come from teachers and parents themselves and from New York State itself. And I'll tell you, the first I heard about Common Core was from my hairdresser. First, I sort of started to see the pain because her son, who once loved school, would come home crying. And my experience in the classroom, even as a law professor, although I also had that other experience, is that kids do not learn well under stress. And that if you use high-stakes testing, not just Common Core, but other forms of high-stakes testing as well, if you use high-stakes testing to test teachers and to either give them salaries or not based on how their students perform, that creates an enormous amount of stress in the classroom. And kids are humans, they pick up on that. They're incredibly emotionally sensitive to teachers' own stress and discomfort with that. So I think that schools, my base belief is there's no silver bullet around schools. Any effort around silver bullet is false. I'm very offended by the idea that you can replace funding with testing. As a farmer, I once heard said, you can't fatten a hog by weighing it. Especially not with tilted scales. So basically, I think I've started to answer most of your questions about the way that I approach it is that ultimately what I gather is that teachers perform well when there's a mentorship program. That is the way to sort of allow teachers to be the best teachers they can. I believe that they should have an opportunity to have just cause before being fired, just to be very clear. And there's a real assault right now. Campbell Brown is sort of aggressively assaulting public schools, blaming teachers for their failures. But schools perform when teachers are trusted. And so and the schools are funded, and kids have an opportunity to be seen for who they are. And kids with disabilities make sure that they have the right resources. And all of those things, I think, are things that are missing from the way that we're currently approaching education.
The governor of the neighboring state of New Jersey is currently under investigation. As you might know, there's a federal prosecutor there. And one of the issues that they're looking at is moving money, several billions of dollars, that was to build the third tunnel from New Jersey to Manhattan. And they got approval from the Port of Authority to move that, and it's being questioned and looked at very carefully. You may be familiar with the case. The money was moved so that Christie could use it elsewhere in New Jersey alone, having nothing to do with New York. And since Port Authority is a bi-state commission, how could that have happened under the watch of a governor who, as you described, is very powerful and is watching all things? So do you think there was a wink and a nod that go ahead and do it, and why hasn't he spoken out on this issue?
I'm so glad you raised that. On July 3rd, do you remember what you were doing July 3rd at 5 o'clock?
I don't remember what I was doing today at 5 o'clock.
Well, if you know anything about politics, the press release you get at July 3rd at 5 o'clock is the press release that somebody wants buried. Because everybody's preparing for the long weekend and the holiday. And July 3rd at 5 o'clock, a press release was issued about the Port Authority and questions concerning its administration.
Yes.
It was the group that was designed to investigate the Port Authority and questions about its administration and Christie's own involvement and possibly Cuomo's,
Right.
was supposed to issue a report within 60 days. Around July 3rd, but instead they issued a statement saying, we will issue a report in January.
Oh.
So I do not know why this is so sensitive, but I will not say that I know anything about what Governor Cuomo does. I know he has his own problems with bridges. There's some dirty money in the Tappan Zee project, and but his relationship with Christie is very troubling. His failure of leadership around the Port Authority is very troubling. I thought about going to do a campaign stop in New Jersey because it seems like some of our money's going over there. So it's a very important issue, and thank you for raising it.
We have a de facto moratorium, but at the same time, I think in one place in Elmira, they're slated to accept 500,000 tons of drill cuttings. What is your position on waste, radioactive waste coming into New York and the further generation of radioactive waste at Indian Point and the 2 other nuclear complexes in the state?
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you it's something I need to study more, you know, whether it's regulated or banned, but my inclination is to ban it. Because I think, again, we need to just move in a very clear direction. And it's something I need to learn more about, but I don't know why we wouldn't ban it. It's so dangerous, and I think it'll also help slow the growth of this industry, which is dangerous.
And nuclear power, the 3 nuclear power complexes that's working in the state, and as the New York Times has reported, there's an ever-growing plume of radioactive tritium leaching out from Indian Point.
Yeah, no, I think we should close Indian Point. I mean, you'll find very quickly, I'm pretty straight. Once I know what I think, unlike the current governor, you'll know where I stand. And I was talking earlier about the importance of owning our own power sources. And not only is nuclear power dangerous and repeatedly shown to be so, but it's an example of us not owning our own power sources. So it's going to cost money. But we need to be investing in renewables, and we need to be doing it now and at very high levels. That's my deep, deep belief. I mean, this is our future. I mean, this is, sometimes I don't know what Governor Cuomo sees when he sees New York in 2035 or 2040. But I see 2 very, very different New Yorks depending on what we do with energy policy. And I think we have to move very quickly, because it's not going to happen tomorrow. We can't move to renewables entirely tomorrow, but we can certainly move quicker by 2025 or 2030 if we start today.
Could you elaborate on how we can get or how we can afford a broadband system that you alluded to? Because I'm stuck, as many of us are, with a satellite system. It's almost intolerable. Can we really do this? Can we afford to have a system like people in the city have? Conduct our business, our homework, etc.
Broadband in this country is embarrassing. It is faster and cheaper throughout Europe. And it's in part because of that antitrust policy I was talking about, taking on big cable. But right now it's basically under the PSC's authority to regulate, what our current cable companies do. And then we can also, as a state, actively invest in building out. So it's just a question of a policy priority. And I think it is a policy priority. So it's both taking on the big powers and either regulating them or breaking them up, and also aggressively investing, because we absolutely can have that.
I was wondering if you were aware that in the past several years, close to 700,000 properties have been foreclosed upon by trustees of mortgage-backed securities in New York State alone. There is some very clear evidence to show that in probably 100% of those cases, none of those trustees in those foreclosures had the note. There is a bill stuck in Albany, which will remain stuck in Albany. And the
Is it produced the note bill that would require them to show the note?
Well, yes. I mean, yeah. In other words, the mortgage is one thing, but if you want to foreclose in a judicial state, you need the note and the mortgage.
Yes.
And there's a law that's stuck in Albany.
Yes.
This comes back to the power of the banks.
Yes.
Again. And when you look at, for instance, the New York State Pension Fund, which is loaded with bank stocks, it's also loaded with more than 70 company stocks of energy stocks, including 600,000 shares of Cabot Oil and Gas, the Constitution Pipeline. So the problem is that it's a cancer in both Washington and in Albany. I don't know what sort of radical treatment you would have for doing that.
I didn't know about the number. I happen to teach property law and the importance of the note, and I didn't know about that bill, which is very interesting. That you should at least prove that you own property before you foreclose upon it.
Yes, if you give me your email, I will send you the details on it, because I fought unsuccessfully. I fought my own pro se case, and one of the reasons I found out I was never going to win was because it's not just the banks, it's all of the regulatory agencies, it's the SEC.
Yes, so as you can see, I like big targets.
Yeah, well, this is a big one.
And it is a big target. And what happened in 2008, I don't know when you lost your home, but it's that so many places lost their home, so many people lost their home, and so maybe they miss a paycheck for 6 months or something, or 2 years, but then they get back, they find a job, and they come back and make a decent offer, and the homes remain empty, despite the fact that they're actually getting a better offer than nothing. And something is deeply, deeply out of whack, and I think you can gather that I think it's deeply out of whack in our political and economic system when you have some places where the rent is too high, property taxes are too high, and other places where there's just empty property standing, even with people who want to pay to get back into them, want to make those payments. And that has a lot to do with the combination of political and economic power. So I'd like to look at the particular bill. In New York State, the banking power is behind many of these different sources of lobbying power. As you say, it's many-headed. So I have a simpler short-term answer, which is that right now the banks aren't being taxed fairly at all in New York State. Under the corporate tax law, they're being taxed at a fraction of the business they actually do in state. And we can tax them at a much higher rate for the business they do within the state. And so at least make sure the big banks pay their fair share. I'd also like to build out a merchant banking system and do something about the IDAs. There's a lot there, but but I'd love to hear about them.
Actually, there's a separate issue too here, because in fact, I had thought of saying to the judge, by the way, that you should recuse yourself because your pension fund owns 3 million shares of the plaintiff's stock. Now, if any judge, and his answer would be, well, who's going to try the case? My answer is, well, no judge in New York State can try it. And that applies obviously to the energy industry, to anywhere where there's a case involving corporations who have power in Washington or the pension fund.
Yes.
It's a big story.
Yes.
I'm a retired teacher,
Uh-huh.
and so bringing up the pension fund is very dear to me. As you continue to speak truth to power, I think it's important to look at how, as you have stated to some degree, how we can build other profitable industries other than oil and gas and banks, because the fiduciary responsibility of a retirement system is to make money on their investments. And so they have to invest in what is making money, what is making a profit. And there are too many laws in New York and in Washington that give various industries means to continue to make profits that should not be allowed.
Yeah, I mean, this is a version of basically crony capitalism, where you see profit making being derived from subsidies and tax breaks as opposed to a competitive and open market. And so I talk about this in different ways. When I talk about the vision of a small business economy, talk to any small business owner, they'll say they can't compete against the big businesses. But we have to be developing out other kinds of industries. I'll say one thing that we haven't talked about, which is the governor's procurement power, the procurement power of the state. And that one thing we can think about to be developing the economy around the state is trying to use the procurement power in places we can to really encourage increased manufacturing as well. So that we're building within the state and not just buying out of state. But there isn't a magic bullet for this either. I do think the long-term plan is infrastructure, investment in the industries that we want to invest in, and investment in a broad way as opposed to in a picking and choosing winners kind of way. And thank you for your service as a teacher. Yes?
Yes, in your petition, I was good on most of your major points, but then a surprising number said to me, how are you on the SAFE Act?
So, I come from gun country, and so my dad hunts, my brother hunts, members of my family hunt, and we have to do something about gun violence. But I found the way in which Cuomo did it, without holding hearings in the middle of the night, to be disrespectful. So, there's a few parts of the SAFE Act that I have some concerns about, but I do think that we, there's other elements that I'm okay with. Yes. It's not a big part of my campaign, to be honest. We're really focused on economic issues, but that's the basic answer.
Comes up, so.
Yeah, no, that's the basic answer. Yes. There's some tracking issues in there that bother me.
I believe there used to be usury laws in this country, and nowadays banks are allowed to charge 30, 40, 50% the actual base rate, prime rate. Is there any chance of that being changed so that the people who can least afford it are not the people who pay 28% to borrow money?
The real difficulty there is that during the Dodd-Frank financial fight, one of the things that the big banks wanted the most is federal preemption over state law, because states tend to have better usury laws than the federal government. So I'd have to look into the particulars, but some of that is limited by federal law, and that's the struggle. Yes.
I was wondering how much chance you think that we will ever get public financing of elections. I mean, it's a great dream, and I've worked for it once, but how are people going to vote to get themselves out of office, in effect?
We have a chance in this state, an amazing chance, and we actually are the key to the whole country here. I'm not just saying that, I've been saying that for years, is that New York State is on the verge. In the 19th district, there was a close race, and the key issue was public financing of elections. The Republican was hitting the Democrat saying, you're doing welfare for politicians. That message used to resonate all the time. It isn't working anymore because people know it is so broken right now, and she won.
Cecilia.
Yes, Cecilia Teachout. I always mispronounce her name. Yes. It is, we have Democratic support is extraordinary. And it used to be that people like you were bravely out there planting the seeds, but this is like, you know, the populists of 130 years ago. You were planting the seeds and it took a while for them to grow. But now there were people at the assembly protesting every day around public financing of elections. There is an opportunity here. Democrats want it. A powerful governor can pass it because there's some problems with the governor being too powerful, but I will tell you, if I am a powerful governor, I will use that power to pass public financing of elections.
There will be authorities in the state. I don't know how many authorities we have. The last time I looked, there was a dormitory authority, an overcoat authority, the thruway authority. It seemed answerable to no one. Have these crossed your ken, and what would you do with them as governor?
The dog kennel authority has not crossed my ken. No, what I'm interested in, the way I approach everything, is in terms of power. Who has power? Who doesn't? Who's it accountable to? And the question is, I think with each of these, and I don't have a full policy on that, I'd be happy to talk to you. You guys are like the most overeducated crowd in the state. I just want to take you back to Manhattan with me and put you in my office and we can build some more policy. So, no, I mean, what I'd have to look at is the questions of power and what it's used for. Because sometimes the governor talks about redundancy in the state, and we just have to reduce redundancy. And I think he's really wrong about that. That there's situations where when he's saying we want to reduce redundancy, he means we want to reduce democracy. But I'd have to look at the particulars. Thank you.
Yeah. In addition to fracking per se, we have a few, speaking of federal preemption, speaking of infrastructure,
yes.
Speaking of power, we have a few pipelines that are threatening and some are already in. Is there anything that the governor can do in a bully pulpit way, given that this is federally mandated, federally regulated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the bully pulpit matters more. That, you know, I just have this vision of New York where we should be leading. Something I haven't talked about is immigration. This relates, but is that we're having a national debate about immigration, and we're having a national debate about education, we're having a national debate about energy policy. And in all of these areas, Governor Cuomo is not only not leading, he's hiding. And New York has a public that is willing to lead on these issues. I mean, we are lucky in that way, in having such a democratic state. We're really lucky. So, just to say on immigration, you know, we're having this national debate and Governor Cuomo is silent on it. New York, this is the Statue of Liberty state. We should be leading on being welcoming instead of picking as his lieutenant governor somebody who's run as an anti-immigrant. Kathy Hochul. And on energy policy, we have the opportunity again. I mean, I'm just so impressed. You've led in standing up to hydrofracking. Now let's lead in all kinds of other ways in sort of a global energy policy area. And some of that's going to be the actual work of the state, and some of that's going to be the bully pulpit.
You're on fire. Almost toast.